Catechesis podcast. Join us on our journey to learn more about the Christian faith and how we can live it out in our modern world. Determining what's real and what's fake is tougher than ever before. We have Chris Altieri with us to chat about the news. Over to you, Travis.
Thanks, Rigel, and thank you everyone for tuning in for another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis, chatting about the news today, all things news, specifically differentiating fake news from real news. And with our friend Chris, we're going to be chatting about following the news without losing your faith. So to start off, as we always do, we're going to draw upon the wisdom of someone else. I'm going to pull a quote here from Pope St. Paul VI's 1972 message for World Communications Day. He said as follows: "Communicators must observe facts carefully, check their accuracy, make a critical evaluation of the sources of their information, and finally, pass on their findings. The burden of responsibility is all the greater when, as often happens, the reporter is called upon not only to give the simple facts of a case, but also to explain its implications by providing commentary and the elements needed for a fair assessment." So to chat with us about this today, we are joined by Chris Altieri. Chris is a journalist, editor, and author of 3 books, including the recent one, Reading the News Without Losing Your Faith, which was published by the Catholic Truth Society in 2021. Chris contributed to the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Catholicism, 2nd edition, 2023. He is a contributing editor to Catholic World Report, and he teaches at Fairfield College Preparatory School in Fairfield, Connecticut. So Chris, thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, fellas.
Awesome. Well, maybe to start off, Chris, you know a little bit more than we do about news, journalism, the industry. Can you walk us through your background a little bit, how you got involved in news media and what that has looked like throughout your career to date?
Sure. I mean, the short version of a 25-year-long story, right? I had written some, occasional pieces for the local newspaper back home when I was already living in Rome, right around the end of JP2's reign, Pope St. John Paul II. Sorry, folks. You spend a quarter century in Rome, and your sense of piety and devotion tend to erode. He's a saint in heaven. Pray for us. But let's not stand on ceremony. So the end of the fellow who would come to be known as Pope St. John Paul II was a time that I sort of started to write occasional pieces for the hometown newspaper. I was already living in Rome. This is, sometime between then the late 90s and the early aughts. Then was married in 2002. My firstborn was not quite a honeymoon baby, but came along pretty quick. And I was at what I thought was the tail end of my post-grad work, my doctoral dissertation at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. And so I was looking for a steady paycheck, and it happened that the stars aligned, and they needed some help on the desk for the summer at Vatican Radio. So I picked up a few shifts and apparently had a face for radio, as they say. The fellow who was already there left to go on to other projects, and they offered me the steady gig, which I took at the time, and that was right around 2005. And this is going back a while, right? So my memory of this is a little fuzzy, but I think I was going to come in and sort of start training up right around the time of the transition, and everyone in the office decided that sede vacante was not the best period to have a slow guy gumming up the work. So I waited until things had settled down at least marginally, and started coming in maybe in June or July of 2005, and was there until the end of 2017. In fact, my last broadcast at Vatican Radio was the 6:15 p.m. Rome time news bulletin on December 31st of that year.
Hmm. Wow.
By the time I left, I was ready to sort of step out of the 24-hour news cycle, and put my feet up a little bit, survey the situation, maybe make some easy money consulting, and write a couple of books that I'd had on the back burner.
Hmm.
Also, spend some time with my family while they still recognized me and liked having me around at least a little. Uh, but again, long story short, ish. Couple of weeks after my last broadcast, while I was just getting the hang of not being out the door at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning every day,
Hmm.
Pope Francis went to Chile, and that's when uh, the Chilean chapter of the ongoing, crisis of clerical and hierarchical leadership in the church, especially regarding uh, sexual abuse and cover up, sort of exploded in Francis's lap.
Hmm.
There was a lot of talk around that, a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. I don't think that people, or I didn't think at the time that folks were really understanding. There's a lot of talk of the horror, and of course it was a horrible thing, right? And it still is.
Hmm.
But there was little sign that folks were understanding the institutional dynamics of the crisis, and so I wrote what I thought was going to be a one-off explainer, talking about the sort of, all right, guys, this is what happened. Here are the stakes in this. Here are the points at which personal quirks and foibles and traits of character in leaders, as well as institutional problems, have sort of converged to create a perfect storm. I went from I'm just going to do this one thing and go back to my cave, to filing, 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week for the next like 80 weeks straight. And ended up coming on at the Catholic Herald, the English magazine, which was then is beginning to build a bigger international and online presence. I started their Rome bureau. I was the
Hmm.
Herald's Rome bureau for a while, and then their international, their international editor, and their executive editor. I came back to the States in 2021, June, the tail end of COVID. Decided again it was time for me to step away from that grind, but things did not really slow down. And so I've written enough over the past 3 years to keep my byline fresh, make sure folks don't forget about me, but mostly as an analyst. Sure, I write with a point of view, but I think it's that of an informed insider.
Hmm.
I'm not a crusader. I'm not a partisan, and my concern is with power dynamics,
Hmm.
governance, questions like that. Rather than seeing whether Pope Francis or anybody else passes the heresy test. Frankly, I don't care, and I don't know why anyone would care about my opinion of such matters. But what's doing? Yeah, I could tell you something about that.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so, I mean, I suppose that's my story in a nutshell. It's the one I'm giving you, and it's the one I'm sticking to.
So, Larry, we're speaking today specifically about your book, Reading the News Without Losing Your Faith. And even the title alone tells me that you're very honed in to the state of the world. And, you have a very good idea for who your ideal reader would be, because that's literally what happens when we read the news is, you know, it's hard to stick to our faith. And so I'm really curious, what was the inspiration for the book? And maybe tell us a little bit about it as well.
Inspiration, fellas. I write for a living. I don't get inspiration. I get hunger pains. Inspiration. Come on. uh, my very dear friend Victoria Seed, who is who was acquisitions editor, I believe was her official title at the Catholic Truth Society asked me to write the book, and I said yes.
Hmm.
And you have her to thank for the title too. I wanted reading the news without becoming unhinged.
That would have worked too. It
That
would have
was
worked.
mine. And guys, that's how it happened.
Hmm.
Late 2020, early 2021. So we're right in the middle of Rona tide at that point that
Mm-hmm.
that she came to me with that idea, and
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed writing it. It was a slim volume. I think it's only like 90 pages long or something like that. And it has some good stories. There's a little inside baseball. I won't say tales out of school, but if you want to see them that way, go ahead. And it takes a sort of a telescopic approach to the changes in the media landscape and environment that we've had. So I, you know, take a 30,000-foot view or even an 80,000-foot view and then zoom in on some particulars and then zoom back out, which I hope is done in a way that makes it easy to follow and fun to read, and most importantly, I suppose, helpful to folks to navigate some pretty fraught waters that we're sailing.
Chris, I'd love to jump into you. You highlighted something there in your explanation of your background and sort of what first got you into writing for a living, as it were, which is the seemingly ever unfolding sexual abuse crisis in the church. And for those people who have listened to the podcast before, they know that I'm a convert to the faith. I come from my father was a Baptist pastor, and one of the most difficult conversations I had to have with my father was, and he's been in the evangelical world, he's been very active addressing their own sexual abuse crises. This isn't unique to Catholics. So for anyone who's thinking that this is just a Catholic problem, it's anything but that. But when you have by far the biggest church in the world, and it's not even close, of course, the crisis seems particularly heinous because the numbers are so much bigger. And we just know that. But nonetheless, there is the perception that this is a uniquely Catholic problem in the minds of some people. And I actually stumbled upon your work first, writing about the sexual abuse crisis probably about 2 years ago, and I've followed your writing on that topic specifically. Now, I don't know if you intended to become sort of an expert voice in that, or if it just kind of happened. But I also know that it is very hard for an uneducated person just reading random articles to know what am I consuming here? Should this be changing my perspective of the church? Should this be changing my perspective of the hierarchy in the church? Chris, what have you found? Did you intend to become sort of a quasi expert on this specific issue that might be the very issue of our time? Or did you just sort of stumbled into it? And what has it done to you as a believer yourself as you've followed this story develop over the years?
You put at least 5 discrete questions out there all at once, and I'm that I'll sort of dive right in, and if you guys think I haven't answered adequately, you go ahead.
Perfect.
But I'm gonna use an old in the eternal dance between the pas de Dieu of hacks and flacks. One of the things that flacks will teach their principals and will occasionally do themselves when they're talking to the hacks. Hacks and flacks, by the way, flacks are communications experts and spokesmen, press office directors, etc. And hacks are, well, that's me. Scribblers, as we say, journalists, right? You challenge the premise of the question. You don't necessarily grant the premise of the question. I never have doubted for a second that the bark of Peter will come safely to port.
Hmm.
All right. Right now she's on the sea. She's underway, and
Hmm.
how well the bark is being governed underway. All bets are off on that, and always have been.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who reads
Right.
the Acts of the Apostles as a how-to manual of good governance is doing it wrong.
Hmm.
So that's one thing that I would say. I came to the matter to see, and knew a better, more than the average bear about church history as well.
Mm-hmm.
And had been in Rome long enough to know how much human nature is going around the place. I didn't intend to become an expert, I suppose. And again, I'm not sure that I am. Um, we'd have to drill down on what exactly you mean. I do know a whole lot about the crisis, and not just the scandal. I'd make
Mm,
a sharp distinction between the crisis, which is a general crisis of clerical and hierarchical leadership and of leadership culture that is protracted. You know, it's
mm,
been there for quite some time, and I distinguish that from the scandal. You know, the crisis erupts into scandal and has from time to time, and you know, with a fair degree of regularity and intensity over the past 40 odd years. In the English speaking world, the first really big case was Gilbert Gotha down in Louisiana. It was back in the 80s. And credit where credit is due. You know, I don't always care for their editorial line, but the National Catholic Reporter basically kept that story in the news until it exploded into international and worldwide scandal in the early aughts, or you know, around the time that the Spotlight investigation took off. But the roots of that crisis and the crisis itself uh, have been around for a good deal longer than that, and that's a story that deserves to be told in a systematic way. It's only come out piecemeal. If I win the lottery or get a research grant, that'll be one of the things that I set about doing, telling that story in a systematic way. I've done major investigations as well. You know, you mentioned I haven't done much in that way in the past couple of years because I've been, you know, haven't had a masthead behind me, and the old, you know, that was partly by choice, right, or largely by choice. One I won't say I regret, but that certainly had a downside. You know, I sort of look around and, you know, wonder whether there's anybody doing it as well or as consistently as I was. Um, it'll sound like a cop out. I think that those sorts of questions are above my pay grade, but I do know that it can't hurt for us to begin to think seriously about what I've begun to call the constitutional crisis in the church, which means how do we organize power in a way that does not fall foul of the church's divinely given hierarchical constitution. Um, we know that reform, even of what appear to be fundamental structures, is possible. It's an empirical matter. We've organized ourselves differently in the past, right? And there's no reason in principle why we can't do so again in the future. We also know that mistakes will be made, and there's no such thing as a perfect system. And even if there were, there are no perfect people. Um, so the sooner we begin to think about things like that, I think the better we'll be.
and I want to piggyback off that maybe because I think for the average person, right? And I love to read, so I'm actually amazed that I'm a baby Catholic. I've just recently come into the church, but I am often talking to cradle Catholics. I realize how much better informed I am on a lot of things related to the church and the goings ons of the church. Just I find it interesting, and so I follow it way more. So I wouldn't even categorize myself as the average Catholic when it comes to matters of what's actually going on in the church, matters affecting the church, the structure of the church, the hierarchy, matters of doctrine and stuff. So if we think about the average Catholic Christian today who will consume some news, I am sympathetic to how hard it is for them to suss out what is true and what is not true. Even if you look at different tellings of the exact same event from different Catholic news organizations, there will be an explicitly political bias in some of them, right? And I won't name any of the organizations, but it's very clear that the exact same factual circumstances will be conveyed to Catholic consumers very differently.
I was actually just going to say, as part of that, Travis, if we read the secular news and we get a certain perspective, and then we're thinking, oh, this doesn't feel quite like the truth, and I want a little bit more of the truth, and we go to a Catholic news source, like that doesn't mean it's any better. It's sometimes it just leads to more confusion, and that's been my experience, at least in some cases.
Exactly that. And so, Chris, I guess from your perspective, if as Catholics we have to be for the truth, it's almost cliche to say it, but I will admit again, and I've talked about this many times before on the podcast, the fact that I believe Catholicism is true is the literal reason I became Catholic, because I asked myself the question about every other religious tradition, including the one I grew up in, is this true? And when I couldn't say yes confidently, I kept looking, and Catholicism is where I stopped and said, this is true. So we have to be for the truth. And we're talking about, fake news and real news, or sussing out the truth. And there's almost a contradiction in some ways when people who are in the world of Catholicism might not be as committed to the truth or sharing the truth the right way. And hopefully journalists can be a part of making that a reality so we can figure out what is the true in messy matters like the ones that you've touched on. So, Chris, I'd love to ask, when you're talking to friends, family, average Catholics who are just trying to live their Catholic lives, and they don't know how to make sense of some of the stuff that's coming out in the news, whether it's about the church itself or unrelated matters, what are the things that you're telling people or would tell people trying to focus on? How do I differentiate between what is true and what is not when I'm consuming news?
You're asking the wrong question.
Interesting. Tell me which question I should be asking.
What happened?
Interesting.
If the news in scare quotes that you're reading isn't giving you the 5 W's without fear or favor, as we say in the trade, then whatever you're getting, and there may be a fact pattern there may be a factual basis for what you're reading, right? It's not news, it's something else. All right.
Right.
And if people are telling you how awful so and so is without telling you what so and so did, or putting his awfulness, his evident rottenness above the what, right? Or if you're being directed in the copy pretty clearly, even if not explicitly, to a takeaway that is, boy, these guys are terrible, right? They're just bad at being human. Then you're probably you're almost certainly not reading something that is supposed to be news.
It would be almost, in that instance, you'd be reading something that's got a very obvious ideological bent or political motivation or something, and it's not focused on the facts. You're saying the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why.
Go slow. Don't mistake, and don't tell me what I'm saying. Let me say it.
Okay.
So before you go attributing motive to people, all right, realize that the very first step, remember, you asked me to talk about, how people who are reading the news, as you said, consumers, right?
Yeah.
What are they supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is figure out what kind of copy you're reading. Is this a straight news report? Is it analysis? Is it commentary? If it's a straight news report, or if it purports to be a straight news report, is it really, in fact?
Right.
And if you have any doubt about that, well, go and see what else you can find about the story from, newspapers, whether they're Catholic or mainstream. Sometimes stories about the church that you'll encounter in the mainstream press are going to get certain technical things wrong. The vocabulary is not going to be precise. And sometimes the story will be overly simplified. That will usually have been done largely by an editor rather than a reporter. Okay, who doesn't trust his readers to to understand all of the technical ins and the outs. And by the way, he's not necessarily, he or she I should say, is not the editor's not necessarily wrong about that, right? You can, you know, fairly reliably conclude that, you know what, there's something here. There's something worth knowing about. There's something worth understanding. Right. So number one is know what kind of copy you're reading. Develop the capacity for distinction. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to distinguish straight news from news analysis and affairs analysis, and be able to distinguish both of those from commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Commentary has a place, but be ready always to ask yourself when you have a piece of commentary before you, who is this guy and why should I care what his opinion is? What's his skin in the game? What is he writing from? You know, and if you're reading an interview with a senior church figure, for example, right? Pay attention to the questions that the interviewer's asking. Pay attention to the questions the interviewer isn't asking. Do the mental exercise that I performed with you guys a little earlier. Check the premises of the questions. Learn to pay close attention to how they are formed. How many questions are really in there? There's the old double-barreled question that sometimes will sneak in. And that's just one example of many that questions themselves can direct answers. Read actively, if you will, and make your criteria of reliability something other than, well, can I trust the people who work at this outfit to say the creed without crossing their fingers or otherwise fudging?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because while I hope they can say the creed without crossing their fingers or otherwise fudging, that's not what makes you a good journalist. So, what are the examples that I like to give? I don't know how much you guys know about history of the Soviet Union.
Not a ton, but I love talking about Marxism and stuff, so I know just enough to be dangerous, but I'm sure you know way more than we do.
Quit buttering me up, fellas. My hindquarters can't be kissed. The Soviet army had a problem. World War II was interesting. There were political officers assigned to units, and I can't remember what size unit was the smallest that got one, but they were pretty ubiquitous. And their job was to encourage morale, essentially, right? Eventually, though, in pretty short order, in fact, they were used to determine the political reliability of the officers and of potential or prospective new officers. And in the Soviet army, in lots of places, political reliability was more important than battlefield competence. And you can see how that's a problem for an army at war. And it doesn't engender a culture of effective leadership. There was a case when the Vatican either sued or was thinking about suing, had taken some or was contemplating action against a small little Spanish outfit. They used Vaticana in the Spanish outfit used Vaticana in their name, right? And they retained the services. The Vatican retained the services of some white shoe firm in New York, and turns out that firm had, given money to the marriage equality push in New York, and this is Vatican retained services of a firm that's is pro gay marriage. And you go, well, look, if you're gonna hire a law firm, at that level, chances are that they gave money to that cause. It's the world we live in, fellas. Not everything is a culture war battlefield or issue. And also, and here's the most important thing, you're missing the story. The story is, why is the Vatican threatening some outfit that, I won't say that it's being run out of, the guy's mom's basement, but, poco ci manca, as we say in Italian. It's close to that, This tiny little mom and pop outfit. Why are you sicking white shoe New York lawyers on them? That's a story to me. And if fighting the culture war is more important to you than understanding how the Vatican is and is not using power, well, then I think we got a problem. Here, I'll step on the third rail, give you another illustration, right? Because this one is across the board. Pardon me, I don't have my mute mic here, and I may cough. There. You guys can leave that in, or you can edit it out.
I think we'll leave it in.
When Francis issued Amoris Laetitia, right?
Yeah.
It was the world blew up, and everybody had an opinion, and it was. I'll use a technical term here, fellas. It was bonkers. And everybody on every side was accusing everybody else of being a dissenter. And my question was, dissenting from what? It's a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which means it's a sort of official encouragement. Okay? It was, if I could put it in non-technical terms, a conversation starter. Only, did you notice what happened? Lots of bishops around the world decided to skip the part where we had the conversation and go straight to, we're going to implement particular law.
Right.
For our area of the church. And then Pope Francis put his fingers on those scales and, and tried to, backdoor his private letter into, making it official magisterium or authentic magisterium, which sounds neat, but doesn't really tell you much of anything. It's still a private letter, and going into the Acta Apostolicae Sedis doesn't make it other than what it was, if that makes sense, right? And you had people left, right, and center screaming about all the wrong things. The question for me in that whole episode was, why do we need special legislation in order to implement a conversation starter? Why don't we have the conversation? One way that I've put it is, I don't know whether you guys have ever seen The Untouchables.
Yes.
All right. Well, the scene when Frank Nitty's henchman is in Sergeant Malone's flat, and his job is to lure Malone out into the alleyway behind the house so that Frank Nitty can blast him with a Tommy gun. So he lets Malone get the drop on him, and Malone has that great line, right? Ain't it just like a wop? You bring a knife to a gunfight. Chases him out in the alley and gets blasted away. Well, I've gotten some mileage out of this. I've used it in copy, and I said it before, but I'll, my line is, don't bring a Denzinger to a gunfight, guys. It's a mistake. And if there's one thing that I hope you guys could take away, it's not that theology, that doctrine, that these are things that are relatively unimportant. Okay, that's not the case. Doctrine is, you're absolutely right, supremely important. Okay, but it's important in the way that it's important that the Earth continue to revolve around the sun, guys.
Hmm.
That's important.
Yeah.
And if the Earth is not revolving around the sun, then whatever mundane difficulties we have are going to take a back seat to that.
Mm.
Hmm.
Right.
It's a good way of putting it.
But there's also nothing we can really do about it. Doctrine will take care of itself. That's what the doctrine of that's what the dogma of the indefectibility of the church means.
Yeah.
All right? It usually takes centuries for things to work out. But they'll work themselves out.
Mm-hmm.
And if right now we got a little bit of confusion, yeah, we'll get through it.
And it's always been the case. There's been a little bit of confusion since the beginning.
The idea that there is a so that there was some golden age where everything was hunky dory and ironed out, it didn't exist.
Never happened.
And it's just that news and media is just much more prevalent now, and so we hear about a lot more things than people in those days did. The same problems existed probably back then as well. There were periods of time throughout the church, I'm sure, where the same problems existed, but most people didn't hear about it, so they didn't worry themselves about it. But now news is so widespread, we just have access to all the information.
And probably even like 100 years. And I'd be curious your thoughts on this, Chris. I saw something recently where, and I had never thought about this before, but then I realized, how could it be otherwise? Until probably like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, most Catholics in the world didn't even know what the Pope looked like. And in fact, there were times before that where popes would change and Catholics in parts of the world wouldn't even know there was a new pope, because we didn't have what we have today, which is rapidly accessible information. And so the idea that every single word that comes out of Pope Francis's mouth today has to be analyzed and picked apart, well, that's because of things like Twitter or X, but that is not normal from a historical perspective. It's a new era, sort of. And so curious from your perspective, that's the world that we live in now. And you're right. Sometimes things take centuries to play out over time, and they will sort themselves out. But today, it's so hard for us to accept that because we're used to dissection of every word the Pope says, whereas prior popes, the words that they say weren't even known to the vast majority of Catholics around the world. Would you agree with that? Is that sort of your perception as well?
Well, again, a leading question is a leading question, even if you ask it in a roundabout way there, Travis. Something similar in many respects when it comes to the state of journalism, of information.
Mm-hmm.
All right, there was this golden age of journalism between the 1930s and especially in print journalism. The between the 1930s and the 1960s. You can push it back, from the 20s to the 60s or 70s. Certainly in the past, right? And we imagine that this age in which the ethical code governing the work of news gathering, writing, and presentation were followed in the main, and generally agreed upon among both readers. And to the extent such a period ever existed, it was very brief if you look at by comparison with the history of information and information technology. And if you go back to the age of print, right? So the printing press is invented in the middle of the 15th century, right? when the world is already going to hell in a handbasket. This is
Hmm.
within, the same decade or two that Constantinople fell, that the European Christendom was disintegrating.
Hmm.
Catholicism in Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and incompetence. Um, and all of a sudden, there's this extremely powerful, therefore extremely disruptive new technology that's burst onto the scene. And it took literal centuries, plural, for us to work out social and institutional mechanisms for harnessing and governing this new power, for discerning good copy from bad, right? Developing criteria for, judging what is a reliable versus what is an unreliable publication. It took us centuries to do that, guys. Okay. And for a couple of decades at the tail end of that long process, when we were already under the enormous pressure of new mass media forms and technologies, radio and television, you know, just as we're beginning to wrap our heads around radio, television comes along. And the internet has been disruptive, more disruptive by orders of magnitude than was the printing press. And the printing press caused wars left and right. And it took us centuries to work out a tolerable system, not perfect, a tolerable system for managing the tension created by that disruptive technology. We're 30 years in, at most 40. I'd say 20, at most 30, really, if you want to talk about, when people started having internet in the house. I was a grown man. And we're surprised that we don't have our heads wrapped all the way around this. Anybody who tells you that he's got, the tiniest sliver of it figured out is either a fool or a liar, or he's selling you something. And those three, I suppose, aren't mutually exclusive.
That's yeah, well said, Chris, and lots in there that I hadn't really considered. We're running out of time here, but Rigel, before we wrap up, do you have any final questions that you want to ask Chris?
Yeah. So, Chris, you've talked about, when we're looking at news, whether to discern whether it's, a news report or commentary. I honestly wonder if there is such a thing as a news report anymore. Is there anything that actually does answer the five W's? I can't remember the last time I read something that didn't have some kind of a bias assigned to it. I think there's also, especially like you mentioned, with the rise of the internet, there's also this incentive for people not to report pure news, because pure news is just information and facts, and that can be ascertained anywhere. So what's the point of an article? Well, it's to add something to that information. So, adding a commentary to that. And that's why things like gossip magazines have blown up, is people want to hear, oh, what's this side saying? And then, oh, what's that side saying? So it just feels like I don't know that I've ever, or not that I've ever, but I don't think in recent memory I've actually read a pure news report.
Well, there is no such thing as purity in nature, Rigel.
That's fair.
Um, okay, that's another fact that people have to, this purity fetish is going to ruin us. Like I said at the, earlier, I said everyone has a take, right? Um, Everyone has a point of view. Every view of every set of facts is going to be partial. And even if it weren't, every presentation in a 500 or 1,000 word nutshell of what is inevitably a complex and complicated set of facts, circumstances, personalities, etc., right? Is going to be partial. But partiality isn't necessarily biased. It's, you've got a guy reporting, and a guy here is just a generic term for a person. All right. Don't nobody go saying, you guys get it.
Yes, we do.
That's inevitable. That's human nature. And like I said also at the beginning, there's a lot of that going around. All right. Um, so don't look for purity, but try to cultivate a feel for who's trying to do the best,
Hmm.
their best, right? are you getting it straight insofar as it can be told? Right? There's always going to be something left out. But is this being left out because it's deliberate? Is the guy being upfront with you? Is he saying, we don't have independent confirmation of this, this, or this, right? And is what I'm getting solid, or is this nameless officials being quoted, right? Is there a reason? Is the guy telling you why they won't come on the record and give their names? Because there are lots of good reasons. Is it fear of reprisal, not authorized to speak? And when things like that happen, very often it'll be a principal, a person in the know who says, "Look, I can't give you this. I can't give this to you for attribution, but I can give it to you on background. You can, say that sources with knowledge of the situation told us, or whatever." You learn to have a feel for which reporters and outlets give you news that is gathered according and presented according to those sorts of standards. If the story is investigative, if it's based on documents obtained, is there opportunity for the other side to give their take? There's always somebody who doesn't want a story out there.
Mm-hmm.
Orwell had a great expression, or at least I've seen it attributed to him, right? And if he didn't say it, he should have. Journalism is publishing something that somebody doesn't want out there.
Hmm.
Everything else is public relations.
Wow.
Hmm.
Did you give the other side a chance?
Hmm.
And did you prevent? The guys who don't want it out there? Did you give them a chance to tell their side? Did you give them a fair shake? Did you give them a chance?
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing your best? Is it evident that you've done your best to sort through what is clearly a messy situation? And is it, guys, is what you're telling me in this news story really something that's in the public interest? Is it something that I have a right to know? Is it something about which I have a duty to be informed, hence the right to know? And usually I'm going to, as a journalist and as a reader of the news, I'm going to err on the side of I want to know. There's an unhealthy gatekeeping attitude to stuff like that
Mm-hmm.
I don't think does us very much good. But not everything is in the public interest.
Right.
And that's also true. So, do you trust the people who are telling you things supposedly in the public interest? The question in order to begin to figure that out, the question that you should be asking is, well, I mean, am I genuinely better for knowing this? Am I better informed? Am I better able to understand? Is my understanding of matters touching the common weal increased, improved by my having read this? Or am I just, angrier at the people that I was already angry at?
Hmm.
Right.
Am I more scared now than I was when I began to read this?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you are scared, but is that the only or the primary effect? Or are you scared? Are you scared because you don't know things that you thought you knew? Or are you scared because you know things you didn't? And are those things that you needed to know or didn't? Those are all questions that we should be asking ourselves as whether as news gatherers or as news readers.
Perfect. Chris, that actually leads me right into, I'm going to give a plug for your book that we have touched on a couple times here. And I'm going to read the description. People can find this on Amazon, where they can also buy the book. So from the description about Chris's book, Reading the News Without Losing Your Faith. In the digital age, it is practically impossible to avoid lurid headlines or hot off the press scandals. When these scandals involve the church, it raises questions for many about what it means for people of faith. Christopher Altieri, a veteran journalist and Vatican expert, offers insight into how the news is made, how to spot clickbait and fake news, and how to discover the real stories behind the shocking headlines. Through a series of recollections from a career in covering the Vatican beat, he offers insight into how he can write about scandal and abuse and how we can read about it without losing faith in the promises of Christ. And I think for our listeners, that is ultimately that's what it comes back to is this podcast exists to try to help people of faith be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, learn how to do that in the secular world. News media would be a part of the secular world, whether we realize it or not. And so, Chris, we really appreciate you joining us here to talk about those of us who don't even know where to begin, maybe trying to make sense of headlines, seemingly scandals and stuff without knowing necessarily the motivations behind where it's coming from and stuff. You've given us a lot to think about. So I'd invite the listeners to check out Chris's book. You can find it on Amazon, I'm sure other places as well. And Chris, yeah, we really enjoyed the conversation. Glad to have had you here. Rigel, do you want to wrap us up in a quick prayer?
Absolutely. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we ask you to keep showing us truth. Give us, your people, the ability to discern your truth, the objective truth. Give us the ability to be grounded in that truth when interpreting the world around us. This is getting harder and harder in the world today, and we need you, as we always do, to help us. We know that you will not abandon your church. We don't see the whole picture like you do, so help us to surrender to your will and your divine plan. We ask all this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rigel. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate it. As always, please share this podcast episode with anyone that has an interest in the news or is a news fanatic that needs to learn from an expert like Chris, who joined us here today. So thank you for tuning in. And until next time, this has been the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast.